Welcome, everyone. Tonight we're going to be discussing how you can make a moral argument for a Trinitarian God. This is a really interesting proposal put forward by, I would say we're getting to be better friends, and that is Adam Johnson, soon to be Dr. Adam Johnson. He'll give us an update on his dissertation in just a minute, but I really hope you stick around to hear this argument. What's so interesting about it, it's a novel approach, it's a novel metaethical model. It has similar elements to other theistic metaethics, but it is still distinct, and he'll explain that even more. But if the argument is successful, then this would get us all the way to at least a God that sounds a whole lot like the Christian God. One of the very defining characteristics of Christianity is this Trinitarian proposal. Not, I don't know of other religions that propose something like that. Maybe Adam does. So, without further ado, I will jump in. Let me pull in Adam here. So, Adam, good evening.
Hello.
It wasn't last week. I think it was like maybe 2 weeks ago, thereabout. I had you on and we discussed Dr. Eric Weilenberg's metaethical model, godless normative realism, he calls it. And you laid out that view. You critiqued that view with the lucky coincidence objection. We looked at some of what the objection is, how Weilenberg responds, and then you critiqued those responses of his. For those that are interested, I would encourage you go and watch that. But tonight, I want you to lay out your own metaethical model. But before you do, just give us a brief update on where things are at with your dissertation and when you'll defend it and so on.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to. So, yeah, this dissertation is something I've been working on in one shape or form for 6 years. So it's all coming to a culmination. I defend it on Monday. So I finished writing it in January, and now Monday, April 13th, the day after Easter, I will have to defend it. And that's in a PhD program. I'll have a few professors who will just grill me for a couple hours. And normally you would do this in person, but with the whole situation that we're facing, they're allowing me to do it via Skype. So I'll Skype in with a few professors on Monday afternoon, and they'll grill me and challenge my dissertation, and I'll have to defend it. And if that goes well, I will graduate with my PhD in May.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm very excited, and we were just talking before we started that we hope this dissertation gets published, and I will definitely read the whole thing when it does.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. That is the goal. We'll look for a publisher maybe sometime this summer. We'll start going down that route.
Perfect. All right. Well, let's jump in to the discussion tonight. So first thing I wanted to ask you is, what is your thesis? What's the thesis of this dissertation? Because that's going to give us an idea of what your Trinitarian metaethical model is.
Yeah, so my dissertation in a nutshell is just to compare and contrast between my metaethical model, my explanation of where objective morality comes from, and I compare and contrast my model with Eric Weilenberg's. And I'm arguing that mine is a superior model, mine is a more likely explanation for objective morality. So, as you can imagine, that I'm critiquing his model and I'm promoting mine and showing how mine better explains the reality that we face and just makes more philosophical sense, more plausible. So I guess my thesis in a nutshell would be, let me just read the thesis, at least the part of the dissertation where I'm developing my own metaethical model. So I'll just read it for you. So I'm arguing that the absolute ground of objective moral values and duties is God's Trinitarian nature, as found in and expressed among the loving relationships between the persons of the Trinity. So, as you mentioned, I call my proposal a Trinitarian metaethical theory, and it's TMT is the abbreviation that I use, TMT. And I've been thinking, I joke around about this, but I've been thinking about throwing in some word that starts with N somehow in there, so then I could call it the TMNT. If you know that reference.
Is that related to Transformers?
No,
No.
close. Another 80s pop culture. Teenage Mutant Ninja
Oh,
Turtles.
what am I thinking? Of course, yeah. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. My nephews went through stages where they were like obsessed with those guys.
Yeah, I'm a child of the 80s, so I was telling Jordan earlier that I collect Masterpiece Transformers. Don't collect any turtle stuff, but Transformers is another pop culture thing of the 80s that I grew up with. And back at it now as an adult. I call it my midlife crisis.
All right, well, I'll put up the slide to just lay out the moral argument that you present for a Trinitarian God. And if you want, you can explain it, but it's on the screen now. Premise 1, you want to read it?
Yeah, it'd be simple. So what I'm saying here is that there's many different type of theists that can affirm the basic moral argument for God. So the basic moral argument for God is just there are objective moral truths, premise 1. Premise 2 is God or theism is the best explanation for objective moral truths. Conclusion number 3, therefore God exists. But I'm utilizing my Trinitarian metaethical theory and taking that to the moral argument, and I think I can make the case where the one that you're displaying, premise 2, then says that a Trinitarian God of Christianity is actually the best explanation for objective moral truths. And I think I need to clarify something at this point, because some people might be mistaking or misunderstanding what I'm doing here. I'm not saying that you can go from ground zero, like having no knowledge of the idea of God as Trinity. So I'm not saying that you can go from ground zero and then conclude or discover, if you will, that God is a Trinity through this argument. That's not what I'm saying. This is inference to the best explanation. So when I'm developing my Trinitarian metaethical theory, TMT, I'll start referring to it as developing my TMT, I'm helping myself to scripture and philosophy. I've built my TMT using scripture and theology. However, after I have that TMT, after I have the theory, then I can insert it into premise 2 here in this argument and make the case that this understanding of God seems to fit really well, seems to be a better explanation for objective morality than, let's say, the non-Trinitarian God of Islam. So it's arguing this way is more of an inference to the best explanation, more of an abductive way of arguing.
Perfect. And we will see how much time we have tonight, because I don't expect you in this conversation to try and defend premise 1. What we discussed before is where your focus lies is mainly on premise 2. And so we will see if we have time to compare your model to Weilenberg's. I know we critiqued Weilenberg's last time, but let's try and see if we have time to discuss, what kind of weaknesses are in your model, and how do those stack up to his, and so forth, if we have time. But before we can even do that, we need to unpack the view. So that's what I want to spend the bulk of the time doing tonight. I'll bring myself back in here. So in the chapter of your dissertation that you shared with me, you said that your Trinitarian metaethical theory has some elements in it that incorporate divine command theory, and it has some elements that incorporate natural law theory. So can you briefly summarize the difference between those other two views, divine command theory and natural law theory?
Yeah, and this will be really, really helpful to your listeners, especially those that are new to this topic. So it's important to keep in mind, even within Christendom, right? Even within the Christian community, there are differences as to how God serves as the foundation of morality. So all Christians would agree that God serves as the foundation of morality, but they would disagree on exactly how God serves in that role or functions as the foundation of morality. So there's two main positions, and you mentioned the Trinitarian the divine command theory and natural law theory. And these are the two main positions. There's more positions, but it's kind of like the doctrine of election, right? You get the two main positions are Calvinism and Arminianism. Other positions, but those are the two most well-known ones. Mm-hmm. So if I take a few minutes here and explain the two main positions, then it'll become clear where my TMT fits in.
Sure.
So let me set it up this way. When it comes to metaethics, Christian, non-Christian, just metaethics in general, there's two different issues that need to be addressed, okay? First of all, there's moral value. And moral value has to do with what makes something good or bad. Okay, so that's the first, moral value. The second one is, the second issue that needs to be dealt with is moral obligation, or sometimes it's called moral duties. And this is more about what makes something right or wrong. So you've got moral value, good or bad, then you've got moral obligation, right or wrong. And they're connected. There's relationships between those two issues, but they're actually two separate issues, so it's important to consider them separately. Mm-hmm. So let me use an example. Murder. Okay. If we're evaluating murder at the level of moral value, we'd say that murder is bad. Okay, so we're talking about the act itself. Mm-hmm. That's the issue of moral value, and there's, of course, a lot of different theories about what makes murder bad or what makes things good or bad, but that's your theory of moral value, whatever that is, what makes murder bad. Mm-hmm. So the second issue is the issue of moral obligation, what we should or shouldn't do. So even after we say that murder is bad with whatever theory we use to, argue that, a separate issue would be, well, should we do it or not? Should we do bad things or not?
Yeah.
And sometimes this is called moral duties, moral obligation. So if we're evaluating murder at the level of moral obligation, we'd say, no, you shouldn't murder. In other words, you have an obligation not to murder others. But you need a theory of that. You need a theory of moral obligation. What generates our obligation not to murder? Mm-hmm. And someone might say, if they're new to this conversation, they might say, well, if something is morally bad, then we shouldn't do it, right? I mean, that seems obvious.
And conflate the two. If it's bad, then it's wrong.
Well, and that'd be one theory of moral obligation. And that's a fine theory. But notice, even in that theory, there's two things going on. There's the issue of saying that murder is bad, and then there's another theory that says we shouldn't do bad things. Mm-hmm. So there's two issues going on. And just like with moral value, there's a lot of theories about moral obligation, what generates that should, in other words. Okay, now I think we can better understand the difference between divine command theory and natural law theory. Let me start with divine command theory. Now, there's lots of different flavors of divine command theory, so let me preface this by saying I'm going to be talking generally. Not all of my comments are going to apply to all divine command theories. I'm just trying to describe the most common divine command theory ideas. So this is what's really important to keep in mind about divine command theory. A lot of people miss this. Technically, divine command theory is usually only a theory of moral obligation. It's not a theory of moral value. So divine command theory isn't a theory about what makes something good or bad. It's only a theory about what makes something right or wrong, about what generates our duties or obligations, why we should or shouldn't do things. So in a nutshell, divine command theory just says that our obligations are generated by God's commands. That's why it's called divine command theory. So it's God's commands that are generating our moral obligations. Now, another point that's very important, don't think of, in this context at least, don't think of commands as merely verbal, direct instructions from God, like the Ten Commandments. As soon as you say divine command theory, people usually think of, Ten Commandments and Jesus' commandments. But in this context, that's what's so important. We all have jargon. But in this context, commands includes, things like that, direct verbal instruction from God. But most divine command theories would say that in this context, command is being used to refer to all the ways that God makes us aware of moral truth. So it includes direct verbal instructions, but it also includes our moral intuition, our moral conscience, some would say our moral reasoning. So it's not just direct verbal commands. Any way that God makes us aware of our moral duties would fall under this umbrella. So that's divine command theory in a nutshell.
Perfect.
So natural law theory would be the other main view historically, and both of these theories go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So natural law theory is the famous rival to divine command theory, and these guys argue a lot and butt heads, just like Calvinists and Arminians do. And there's a lot of flavors of natural law theory, so again, I'm just trying to talk in generalities. Not everything I say applies to all natural law theories, but usually a natural law theory is going to be a theory about both moral value and moral obligation. So already we have a little bit of a difference, because it's usually natural law is used to explain both issues, moral value and moral obligation. And just as the name implies, the most important thing in most natural law theories is human nature. So the term natural is referring to nature, specifically human nature. So divine command theory, a natural law theorist would say, look, God created human beings in a certain way, or he created human nature in a certain way, so that some things that humans would lead to human flourishing and other things would not. So like lying. Imagine a situation where there was a society where lying was rampant and encouraged, and it was the most common practice. It was just the norm to lie all the time. Well, that society would probably not flourish, because you couldn't work together, you couldn't trust anyone, and that society would probably deteriorate, right? But if there was a society who was very good at truth-telling and that was honest and you could trust people, well, that would cause that society, or human nature, if you will, to flourish, all else being equal.
Yeah.
So a natural law theorist would say what is morally good is based ultimately on human nature, that human nature determines what is morally good or bad. Of course, they would say God is the creator. Theistic natural law theorist would say God is the creator, created human nature in a certain way. So sometimes a natural law theorist will talk about God's intentions, or God created humans with a certain purpose or telos or end in mind. And so anything that they do which helps them accomplish what they were created for is morally good. But then they quickly add that what God created us for is to flourish. And obviously, as you can imagine, there's a lot of discussion about what human flourishing means. And it's not usually like economic flourishing or anything like that. Usually a natural law theorist is going to say human flourishing is defined in terms of, moral virtues, love, loving relationships with others, and ultimately union or a loving relationship with God is what is ultimate human flourishing, right? So as I said, natural law theory provides a theory on moral value that I described, but it also provides a theory of moral obligation. So for most natural law theorists, they would say that our moral obligations are also generated by facts about human nature. And this is the key difference. This is where the natural law theorist and the divine command theorist are going to butt heads. Because a natural law theorist is going to say, God's commands don't generate our moral obligations. Facts about human nature do. So human nature, for a natural law theorist, is the foundation of both moral value and moral obligation. A natural law theorist, a theistic one, a Christian one, is going to say, yes, God gives us commands, of course, but that's not what makes something obligatory for us. What makes something obligatory for us is if it leads to human flourishing or not.
Mm-hmm.
And God knows that, and so of course God commands us to do things that leads to human flourishing, but the human flourishing is the key. That's where it starts. That's what makes something obligatory. So that's the big difference between command theorists and natural law theorists.
Perfect.
Now, last thing I'll say about these two, since divine command theory is only a theory of moral obligation, sometimes people will combine the two theories, and they'll use a natural law theory when it comes to moral value, and then they'll use divine command theory when it comes to moral obligation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fairly common. You see that sometimes. So these theories don't necessarily have to be enemies. They can be combined, but historically, especially when they butt heads over the theory of obligation, that's where they, kick up the most dust, so to speak.
Yeah. And I think that Stephen Evans would be an example of someone. He wrote a book called God and Moral Obligations. I forgot who it was published by, but looks like you've got it there. I can't quite see the cover. It's kind of like in the light.
Yep, you're right. God and Moral Obligation, published by Oxford. And I don't know if he is a proponent of that, but he definitely does discuss that, combining the two theories like that.
Oh, okay. So that's one way to have an account for both moral values and duties, is to use natural law as your theory for the good and divine command theory as your theory for the obligations or duties. So that would be an option. Another option would be to have natural law for both. But now, what does the divine command theorist do for an account of the good? If theirs is only a theory of obligations, what do they, besides natural law, can they appeal to anything else? Or
yeah, for sure. And there's various ideas and various theories here. The most well-known one, probably, especially now over the last 20 or 30 years, would be Robert Adams. And Robert Adams would have more of a divine command theory understanding of moral obligation, but he would then put out a theory of moral value that wouldn't be natural law. It would be more of God as the ultimate moral standard, or God as the moral exemplar, so to speak, and then anything else would be considered morally good insofar as it resembles God in a morally pertinent way. So that would be his theory of the moral good. Perfect.
Okay, so now let's return to your TMT, your Trinitarian metaethical theory. Is it like, or is it a natural law theory? Is it a divine command theory? Some combination? Neither? What is it?
Yeah. Well, I've been doing my best to encourage people not to classify my TMT as either one. I don't. And, obviously everybody else can choose to classify or put me in a camp or group of their choosing, but I would not put myself or my theory in either camp for several reasons. But first, I would say I'm trying to pull in insights from both camps. Okay, so there's, just like with Calvinism, you think of like the 5 points of Calvinism. Maybe somebody agrees with some, but not all of them. You got 4-point Calvinist, whatever. If you lay out the major beliefs of natural law theory, maybe it's 10 points, and then the 7 points of divine command theory. I don't know. But if you lay them out that way, and then you lay out my theory, you would see that I affirm some from both. And so I'm not all the way over here. I'm not all the way over here. And so that's one reason I'm not comfortable putting my theory in either of those boxes. The other reason, though, and this is probably more important, is that I choose to call my theory a Trinitarian metaethical theory because I'm making the case, my proposal is that the Trinity, the Trinitarian relationships in particular, are the most important thing when it comes to God serving as the foundation of morality. Not commands, not definitely not human nature, and not commands. That's not the most important thing. Those play a part, but not the most important. The most foundational, as I understand it, the most foundational thing is God's Trinitarian nature. So that's why I'm calling it a Trinitarian metaethical theory.
Great. Okay, so you've already mentioned these words repeatedly, so I want to define a couple of terms here. One is, what do we mean when we refer to God's nature?
That's a good question. Yeah. All fields develop jargon, and if you're not used to it, that might be confusing, or you might think of it in a more of the way that you use the word nature. So in this context, the term nature simply means all the attributes that something has which is necessary for them to have in order to be that sort of thing. That was a long sentence. Let me just give a simple example. We often talk about human nature, right? So that's what human nature is. Human nature is just all those things about us that makes us human. And we might not know exactly what those things are, but we could, maybe guess or put together a simple list. Maybe our rationality, maybe the fact that we're conscious, maybe our ability to have loving relationships with God or others, maybe the fact that we're made in God's image, our free will. People are going to disagree on what's essential to human nature, but whatever those attributes are, that's what is essential for me to be human. So if I didn't have one of those essential attributes, I wouldn't be human. And then we can think of silly examples. So is it essential for me, in order to be human, to have 10 fingers? Well, no. I mean, because if I lost a finger, I'd still be human, right?
Yep.
Or is it essential to me in order to be human, to have hair on my head? Well, no.
I hope not.
If I lost all my hair, I'd still be human, right? So those things aren't essential. Those aren't part of our human nature. But whatever those things are that make us human, our human nature is, you can think of it as a collection of those things, or that's what our human nature is those attributes that are essential for us to be that. And not only humans would have nature, but if somebody uses this term, they could say, well, that, mice have a nature. They have the nature of being a mouse. There's certain things a mouse needs to have in order to technically to be a mouse. And if they didn't have those, they wouldn't be a mouse. They'd be something else, a dog, whatever. And so we're just, in this context, we're saying the same thing about God. That God's nature is simply all the attributes he has which are essential in order to be God. Whether that's omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, all the things that a being would need in order to be God. That's what his nature is. Those essential attributes, if you will. And don't think of nature as this metaphysically heavyweight thing, like it's separate from God. God just is his nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's who he is. It's his attributes, if you will. The language gets a little bit clumsy, but I think you get across, what I'm trying to communicate.
Yeah. So just like I would say, if you said, well, who is Jordan Hampton? Is he his nature? Yeah, I mean, I'm human. Like that's now. There's more to me than my. You could get just more specific descriptions than just I'm human, and I'm a collection of these characteristics, right? But I might be more than that, but I am at minimum the combination of those things. And similarly, God, when we refer to God's nature, we're talking about the combination of essential attributes, and he can be more than that, but not less than that.
That's a good way to put it. And we always have to be careful, and I need to be careful as well in the last couple of minutes when I was doing my explanation, when we do comparisons between humans and God, because obviously we are different types of beings, right? He's a divine being, and we're a human being.
Mm-hmm.
And we are not our natures in the sense that he is. So, we're created beings, and there's multiple instances of human nature, and we'll get to this here in a minute. There's multiple instances of human nature, right? Because you have a human nature, I have a human nature. We're both humans, so we have the same nature, if you will. But with God, it's different. With God, we're able to say that he is his nature, and this will become more clear when we start talking about the Trinity.
Okay, very good. And so that was the first term, was just we refer to God's nature a lot, so I wanted to define what we mean by that. The second is, and this may be more important, what do we mean when we say God is a Trinity? What does Trinity mean?
Yeah, no, this is really helpful because and our discussion about nature has really led us to this. So quite simply, let me just say a very simple sentence, and we'll have to unpack it. But historically, Christians have understood God as Trinity, and what they mean by that simply is that God is one nature, but three persons. Sometimes instead of the word nature, the term being is used,
Mm-hmm.
but it's meaning the same thing. So I'm going to use the term nature, one nature, but three persons. Now, to unpack that simple sentence, I'm going to use a flawed example. But at least it's a place to start.
Yeah.
Okay. And some of the early Trinitarian theologians, right, in the early church would use this example, even though they admitted it was flawed. But it just helps us start to unpack these things and conceptualize them in our own minds. So here's the flawed example. Imagine three humans in a room, you, me, and my friend Bill. Okay. So we've got three humans in a room. There's three persons. And in a sense, there's one nature there,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or human nature. So you can think of it, okay, we've got in a room, there's three persons, you, me, and Bill, and there's one nature, human nature. Now that's close, that's kind of what we're getting at with God, but here's the difference. In that situation, actually, we don't have just one nature there. We've got three instances of human nature.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see the difference?
Yeah, it would be like I'm just imagining three triangles. If I had three, if I had three triangles in front of me or something like that, it's like you could, in one sense, you could say there's a triangle there. That's the only kind of thing there is, triangle. But like you said, there's three instances of it, three separate entities. Though they have in common the same nature, I guess they don't share in that nature. How would you say it? I'm off to spin it off the top of my head.
Yeah, let me give a a very similar example, but let's use a car instead.
Okay.
So let's say these three guys, me, you, and Bill. Let's say we all have 2019 black Honda Civics, right? You've got one, I've got one, Bill's got one. They're the exact same car. They came off this factory the same day. They look the same. You can hardly tell them apart, right? They're very, very similar. So there's three instances of the same car, if you will.
Yeah,
Three
yeah.
instances of the same type of car. So in that sense, we could say we all have the same car, right? We talk that way, right? We have the same car. But they're actually three different cars, right?
Yeah, that's a good example, yeah.
What if there was only one car and all three of us shared it? So there was only one Civic and all three of us owned it, and in that sense we all have the same car, but in a different sense. And what we're saying about God is more like that there's only one instance of the divine nature, and all three persons share it. I don't know if that's an appropriate word. Language kind of fails us at this point, but it's similar to that, where it's not like there's three persons and they all have a nature that are similar. No, there's only one nature, one being, but there's three persons in it. And this is what causes a lot of confusion, because we're not used to that, right? We're used to one being, one person.
Yeah.
So I'm a being, I'm a human being, and I'm also one person. I'm Adam. You're a being, you're one being, a human being, and you're one person, you're Jordan. But I don't think it's too much of a stretch of an imagination to say, look, there's a being out there, one being, that actually is three persons. And that's what we're saying of God, that he's one being, one nature, but three persons.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm pulling from this, what's amazing and beautiful, and why I'm convinced that this Trinitarian aspect of God is the foundation of morality, is that these three persons within the one being of God love one another. They have loving relationships with each other. And you can see this most clearly in John 17 in the Bible, but it runs throughout Scripture, but John 17 is the clearest window we have into this inter-Trinitarian loving relationships between these three persons. And my proposal is that love, or those loving relationships between the three divine persons in the Trinity, is what is the absolute ground, the absolute foundation of objective moral values and duties.
Okay, so that's the part that I want to unpack one at a time here. So starting with moral values. So you gave us the distinction between values and duties. So how does the Trinitarian metaethical theory account for moral values?
So when I built my model, my Trinitarian metaethical theory, I used Robert Adams as a base. So I started with Robert Adams' model, and his book is Finite and Infinite Good, and it's just a classic. Robert Adams has been a professor at Yale and other universities. So Robert Adams is really well known and respected, both him and his wife, in the philosophical community. His wife passed away a couple years ago, but very well known and respected in the academic community. He's a Christian, and he has this metaethical model that's been out for 20, 30 years, and this is the best book to get your mind around it. And so I started with that model and then added basically the Trinity to it. So like with most things, I'm not coming up with something out of the blue. I'm building on what other thinkers have done before me. So as I think I mentioned before, Robert Adams' metaethical model has two parts, just because there's two issues that have to be dealt with: moral value and moral obligation. And the first part of his theory is the theory of moral value. And Adams' position is that God is the ultimate good. So God is the ultimate moral standard, the ultimate moral exemplar. He is the good, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And then other things or other beings are morally good insofar as they resemble him.
Mm-hmm.
So you could say if they image him, if they imitate him, if they resemble him, however much they resemble him, then we would say they are good.
Yeah.
So it's a resemblance type relationship. And I agree with that. I affirm that. I think that that's biblical. I think that makes a lot of philosophical sense. I mean, it's Platonic in a way, and Adams even says this. It's Platonic in the sense that Adams is using God kind of as Plato used the good or the beautiful in his theory.
Mm-hmm.
That he's the ultimate, and then other things are good when they resemble him. So I agree with that. I affirm that. I think that's what Scripture teaches. However, my TMT goes one step further and extends this idea by proposing that the specific thing being resembled is God's Trinitarian nature, as found in and expressed among the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity. So that's how I'm saying that this is Trinitarian. So when people, humans or angels or whoever, resemble that love, those loving relationships, then they are morally good.
Mm-hmm.
And when they don't, when they do opposite or contrary to that, then that's morally bad.
So can I ask I don't mean to interrupt your train of thought, so you can continue in just a second. I don't know if this is a thought that occurred to me before I met you, but I heard Dr. William Lane Craig, say something in one of his Defenders classes where he kind of questioned this idea. But an idea I had a few years ago was that what makes something good is how loving it is. That love is the thing that's most foundational, and good is kind of like whatever's good is just various expressions of love. Like it has to resemble love to be good.
No, I would totally affirm that. Is exactly what I'm saying. And the only thing I would add to that is that the ultimate foundation and source of love is the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
And so let me just use a simple example, murder. Let's go back to murder again. Because some people would say, look, God is just so different than us, right? And these three divine persons are so different than us. How could our morality have any connection with, those relationships? How could relationships between humans, our moral relationships with each other, whether I murder you or not, how could that have any relationship to the relationships in the members of the Trinity? Because they can't murder each other. I mean, it seems just they're so disconnected. How could there be any resemblance at all?
Mm-hmm.
So what you said actually helps a lot because, and this is where I would bring in, some natural law. And this is where I think natural law is very helpful at this point.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things I disagree with about natural law, but here I think it's very helpful. So let's just discuss murder for a second and why murder is bad. Well, because of the way God made us, because of the way that God made human nature, murder is an unloving thing to do. And doing something unloving doesn't image God.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it's bad.
Mm-hmm.
So just like you said, love is the key here. And I would add to that by saying it's the Trinitarian love, which is the source and primordial foundation of love.
Mm-hmm.
So murder is bad because the way he made human nature, murdering somebody is an unloving thing to do. Thought experiment, it's silly, I know, but sometimes thought experiments are helpful. If God would have created us with a different nature, then possibly murder wouldn't necessarily be unloving.
Mm-hmm.
Silly example, let's say that God created us, our human nature, in such a way that if I murdered you, it would be a very pleasurable experience for you, and you would come back to life 30 seconds later.
Mm-hmm.
That's silly. I know God would probably never create beings like that, but he could, right? And if he did that, then murder wouldn't be an unloving thing to do. In fact, it would be a loving thing to do because you would enjoy it and you'd come back to life 30 seconds later. And so it would be morally good because it would be a loving thing to do. So that's why human nature is important. But human nature, this is where I would disagree with the natural law theorist, human nature isn't the foundation. It's the Trinitarian loving relationships that are the foundation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. So I if I come across it again, I'll maybe email you that quote from William Lane Craig in that Defenders class. Part of the reason that I was very eager to interview you was when David Baggett said that you had developed this Trinitarian metaethical model. I was like, wow, I've had an idea about that, but it's not very well formed or anything. But it was this idea that whatever's good is just an expression of various expressions of love, and love is the most foundational thing. And my thought process maybe then was yours is a nice cleaner argument, but it was something like this: the things that are good, or at least there are some things that are necessarily good. I'll say that there are some things that are necessarily good. But if goodness flows from love, then in some sense, love is necessary. So love could not fail to be instantiated. There'd have to be some, for every possible world you can imagine, love would have to be there.
That's exactly right.
And the challenge with that is only persons can love, it seems, at least. So there's some necessary person, but there's not. You can't. Loving yourself, I feel like, is kind of an empty. Like there's a truth behind loving yourself, but if all there was a person loving themselves, it would feel somewhat like it's missing an important element. And so it seems like there'd have to be at least two persons. And so my thought process was kind of, there are some things that are good, necessarily good. So goodness flows from love. So then in some sense, love is necessary, but love requires a person, or persons. So in some sense, there have to be more than one person. And then I thought, I'm sorry to go on a rant. I'm just throwing my thoughts at you.
That's great.
Then I thought, but this kind of cuts against like Occam's razor. You know what I mean? Where it's like, if you have like, say, two necessary beings, is it possible for there to be two necessary beings? I suppose so. It depends on how you cash out their attributes, as long as they don't conflict, right?
Not two beings, two persons.
Oh, you're right. Yeah. Thank you for catching me on that. Yeah. So, it's funny because when we talk about like a necessary being, and so I was using the plural. But anyway, you get the idea. So I thought Occam's razor might indicate like if there's a way, if it's possible to kind of synthesize these to where you still have this element of there being two or more, but in some sense there's like one thing there. Then you get down to something that looks like the Christian God. That was my thought, and then I read yours and it clarified a lot of things. So if you're watching, sorry for the past 5 minutes. This is my very poor version from a few years ago, but listen to Adam as he critiques and clarifies.
No, I think that's all great. I think it's a great thought process. And, as I said at the beginning, I'm not making the case that we can go from ground zero and take these steps, kind of like what you were doing, and arrive at the Trinity. Anselm, I think famously, if I remember right, thought that we could. And I think Anselm makes an argument from ground zero to the Trinity through some of those steps that you were talking about. But I don't think we can do that. I'm taking the truths of the Trinity from Scripture and divine revelation, and then I'm just asking, Is this a good explanation of objective morality? So I don't have to develop the Trinity from these things.
Mm-hmm.
I can develop it from special revelation. But then when I bring it to the metaethical conversation, boy, it just seems like a great fit there.
Yeah.
And I think you're right about love. One of the things I say in my dissertation, not in the section that I gave you, but in another section, I say the exact same thing that you just did a couple of minutes ago, and that there seems to be really only two necessary commandments. In other words, commandments that couldn't be otherwise. So as I said before, if God would have made us with different natures, then maybe thou shalt not murder wouldn't really have the same force or even apply to us, really. Or like angels. Angels are non-sexual beings, and so angels don't have any. God doesn't give angels any sexual commandments because they're not sexual beings. And if he would have created us as non-sexual beings, which I guess he could have, then there wouldn't be, any moral commandments for us about sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
So those are more contingent commandments because they could have been different or just not apply to us. But I think you use this exact phrase, and I do as well in my dissertation, that there are some necessary commandments that couldn't be otherwise, that have to be the case in every possible world, and that is the two greatest commandments. As Jesus said, love God and love others. And those couldn't be otherwise. Those are necessary commandments that God would necessarily have to command us to do, otherwise it would violate his moral nature if he would command the opposite of that.
Mm-hmm.
Now it plays out differently depending on the being's nature. So angels, would love each other, I would imagine, in unique ways that would be different than how we love each other as humans.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking like friendship and loving our neighbor and stuff like that, not romantic love. So how you love is based a lot on the type of nature God created you with, but love is the ultimate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Jesus even, that was part of what made me kind of think this way, that goodness flows out of love, and not that it's not like love is just one more item that's good. It's not like that. It's that goodness flows out of love, and that's when Jesus says to love God and love others, and then he adds, for on these hang all the law and the prophets. And
everything else is based, it's like that's the foundation.
Yeah.
And I'm saying underneath that foundation is the Trinity, but then these two commandments are the foundation on top of the Trinity, and then everything else is based on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so moral values then, whatever, so when we talk about moral value, we're talking about what's good and bad. So if something is good, then it is good insofar as it resembles the loving relationships between the persons of the Trinity. And if something
that would be my theory.
And if something is bad, then it in some way and to some degree fails to resemble the loving relationships between the persons of the Trinity.
That's what makes it bad.
That's what makes it bad. Yeah.
Or that's what makes it good.
Mm-hmm.
In the flip side.
Yeah. Now, okay, this may come up as an objection to the model later, so it's kind of like a variation of the euthyphro, so I'll throw that at you when I get to objections here in a second.
Okay.
So that's the theory of moral value. Now let's talk about moral obligations. How do you account in the Trinitarian metaethical theory for moral obligations?
Yep. So, and this is where I'm going to pull in some insights from our divine command theorist friends. So, again, using Robert Adams as a base for my model, his theory of moral obligation is a modified divine command theory, and so he's saying, look, it's God's commands which generate our moral obligations, our moral duties. Again, not just direct verbal commands, not just the Ten Commandments, but any way that God makes his intentions or desires or our moral duties aware to us. Mm-hmm. So it could be our moral conscience, our moral intuition. So a person doesn't even have to believe in God, or even know that God exists in order to have moral obligations. All God has to do for them to have moral obligations is make them aware that things are right or wrong, and then that process is what causes them to have moral obligations. They don't even have to be aware that they are commands from God, according to my theory. So, starting with Robert Adams, that's what he would say, and then I would just affirm that, but I would also bring in important truths about God's triunity to expand that aspect of the theory. And this will take a little bit of unpacking, but I'll do my best to make it short and succinct. So I affirm with Adams that our moral obligations are generated by God's commands. One important part about Adams' theory of moral obligation is that he says obligation arises just at a human level from our social relationships. Okay, so he explained this aspect by first in his book Finite and Infinite Goods. He explained this aspect of moral obligation by first affirming a social theory of the nature of obligation, which is affirmed by many, many ethicists. And then he just argued, look, at a human level, our moral obligations arise from our social relationships with each other, with other humans. And then he just expands that to God. So our relationship with God is simply an idealized version of this social relationship theory of obligation. And so you can probably see where I'm going with this. If I bring the Trinity into this, if I expand his model by adding the Trinity to it, then I'm basically saying that, look, what begins it all, the very primordial source of all morality, is a society of persons, if you will, three divine persons in social relationships with each other. And boy, wouldn't it make a lot of sense, since our social relationships are so important to moral obligation, wouldn't it fit very well if God existed as a society of three persons, right? So our social relationships, both with each other and with God, are a reflection, an image, if you will, of the ultimate social relationships between the members of the Trinity. And I've got three reasons, I can try to go through them quick if we've got time, of why adding the Trinity to Adam's model is so helpful.
Yeah, let's run through them. If you're good on time, I'm good on time.
Okay, I think we're at about an hour now, but I'd love to keep going if you're up for it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I kind of mentioned, first of all, just understanding the social Trinitarian context of ultimate reality helps us understand why obligations arise from social relationships. Since God exists as divine persons, three divine persons in relationship with each other, there's a sense in which ultimate reality itself is social. And so all reality is taking place within a social context if God exists as a Trinity. Mm-hmm. In other words, social relationships weren't something new that came about when God created other beings to be in relationship with. Social relationships themselves are a necessary part of ultimate reality, i.e. God. Mm-hmm. And since social relationships are a primordial part of ultimate reality, they enjoy the gravitas of necessity as opposed to just merely being a contingent thing that came about when God created others. So it tells us that social relationships are part of the very fabric of being, the fabric of reality itself. And so we shouldn't be surprised that personal relationships play such a large role in moral obligation. Mm. So the obligations that arise in our social relationship with God are just an image, or flow out of is probably a better way to say it. They flow out of the social relationships within God. Mm-hmm. So it just makes a lot of sense that creation would reflect necessary aspects of the Creator. So it's just a fitting explanation. That's how you argue, abductively, or argue to inference to the best explanation, is it just seems like a very fitting explanation as to why there's a social context to reality such that moral obligations can arise in them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first aspect of why I think bringing the Trinity to moral obligation is useful, and the other two will be much more quick.
Yeah, run through those.
The second one is, and this comes a lot from Duns Scotus. Some of your viewers might recognize that name. He's more of a medieval theologian like Thomas Aquinas, a little bit after Aquinas, if I remember right. But Duns Scotus, I get a lot of these ideas, and part of the second point I'm trying to make from Duns Scotus. And one of Duns Scotus's contemporary advocates is a guy by the name of John Hare at Yale.
Yeah.
And John Hare's got some great books out there about Duns Scotus and divine command theory and metaethics. But anyway.
You think I could get an interview with Hare? I haven't tried reaching out to him.
Yeah, he's responded to a couple of my emails, if I remember right. I've discussed these issues with so many people over the last 6 years. But yeah, it's, a lot of these scholars, they're very open, to talk a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to get him on if I can. Maybe talk about the moral gap or something like that.
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't mean to distract you.
So according to Duns Scotus, God's commands are instructions for the life path by which we can best achieve his ultimate purpose for us. And according to Duns Scotus, and I wholeheartedly affirm this is a big part of my Trinitarian metaethical theory, God created us, the very purpose for our existence is he created us to be co-lovers with the members of the Trinity. So lover has romantic connotations to it. Co-friends, mm-hmm. or loving. He created us to join that loving communion, mm-hmm. to be a friend of God. So he created us to be a part of that loving communion that already existed before creation, mm-hmm. the loving communion of the members of the Trinity. That's the very purpose of our lives, to be in loving relationship with God and with others.
Yeah.
Right? That's the purpose of life, is our loving relationships. And we know this. I mean, our loving relationships are so intertwined with the purpose of life. I mean, when we're on our deathbeds, that's what we talk about, is the loving relationships. That's what's most important to us in life. And it changes throughout our life. Maybe our friends when we're younger, or our parents when we're really young, right? Our siblings, our friends, our spouse, and then our children, our grandchildren. And with God, those loving relationships are the most important thing to life, because that's what we were created for. That's our very purpose. Mm-hmm. So Duns Scotus is just saying, look, God's commands, God has authority over us, yes, but his commands flow not from some sort of a despotic desire to control us. That's not what motivates God's commands. According to Duns Scotus, and I affirm this in my TMT, God's commands flow from a desire that we would enjoy the greatest things possible. Mm-hmm. That is, loving relationships with the members of the Trinity and with other human beings. So the commands, that's why I think this TMT, this understanding of God as Trinity and how this applies to ethics, gives us a whole new conception of commands, and we stop thinking of them as being oppressive, or God is just an authority that tells us what to do. And we think, no, we were created to be co-lovers with the members of the Trinity, and the commands he gives us is the best path to achieve that. Mm-hmm. To be the best lover possible, the best friend possible, in Aristotelian terms, however you want to say it, the best at loving relationships possible. That's what his commands are accomplishing.
Yeah.
And I think that is, at least to me, that's super helpful to have that understanding of God's commands, because it's about the meaning and purpose of life.
Yeah. Yeah, and someone else that I have interviewed, Tim Stratton, told me this sounds a whole lot like kind of his. He takes it a little bit differently, but this thing called purpose theory, and he goes kind of that route where the commands are, I think he says like on purpose for a purpose or something like that, something to be catchy. But it's the idea of we were created for a purpose. That purpose is good in virtue of its lovingness, and so God's commands are the best path to achieve that end for which we were created.
Yep, Tim's a friend of mine. He's here in Nebraska. Did you know that?
Oh, I didn't realize you were in Nebraska. Okay.
Yeah. Tim's in Kearney and I'm in Lincoln. But yeah, Tim and I have had these conversations a lot. And and this is also something that would be similar to, natural law, similar to an aspect of natural law. Because something that's very important to natural law theorists is that, we were created for a purpose, and even like Aquinas and others would say, the ultimate purpose that we were created for is union with God, right? The beatific vision.
Yeah.
Union with God basically is what we were created for. And that's an aspect of natural law that I would affirm, even though there's many aspects of natural law that I would disagree with. This is something where TMT and natural law would get along well. Here's where the difference would be. I, like Duns Scotus, would say that, God could have. It's not that God gave us these commands because they lead to human flourishing. We've talked about that already. We don't need to rehash that. Let me just cover the third thing.
Yeah.
That I think is helpful to this area of moral obligation. Why bringing the Trinity to this issue of moral obligation is helpful. And it's just simply that I think this illumines and fits very well with Jesus' explanation that the greatest commandments are to love God and to love others, and how the rest of the commandments rest on that foundation. I'm quoting from Matthew 22.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why those are the two greatest commandments is because these two commands are instructing us to be like the members of the Trinity. So think about it for a minute, right? So the members of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they both love God, the other members of the Trinity, and they love others, the other members of the Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
And so what these two commands are telling us to do, in a sense, is to be like the members of the Trinity, to love God and to love others.
Mm.
So love, the very basis of morality, originates from within God's inner life of three divine persons in loving communion.
Yeah. Okay, so if you could, I know it's hard, if you could summarize those 3 points as concisely as you could, how would you put it? Because these 3 points are basically your reasons for thinking that this Trinitarian, by bringing the Trinity into our explanation for moral obligations, it fits very nicely. Whereas if we leave the Trinity out, it's not quite as nice a fit.
Yeah, and this is why, I'm developing a paper right now which kind of compares, the Trinitarian God of Christianity with the non-Trinitarian God of Islam, and just asking, which one fits better with objective morality.
Yeah.
So
I'll bring you back on for that paper.
Both Christians and Muslims would agree to the basic moral argument that there is objective morality. God's the best explanation for objective morality, therefore God exists. But if you just want to think about premise 2 in terms of, okay, which is a better explanation for morality, the Trinitarian God or a non-Trinitarian God, let's say, Islam's God. And I would say, for all these reasons I'm discussing, a Trinitarian God fits a lot better. So you asked me to summarize these 3 points again. So bringing the Trinity into Robert Adams' model, divine command theory model of moral obligation, It's helpful for three reasons. One, it explains well why social relationships are such a basic part of reality, and why social relationships are so important to ethics and moral obligation. If God is a society of persons, that ultimate reality is societal in that sense. Ultimate reality is personal and relational. And so it makes a lot of sense that moral obligations would arise in social relationships. The second one is Duns Scotus's, comes from Duns Scotus, and it's just the idea that God's commands, which give us moral obligations, give us the best path to become what he created us for, and that is co-lovers, with the members of the Trinity. Mm-hmm. And then the third one is bringing the Trinity to bear on moral obligation makes a whole lot of sense out of Jesus's commands or Jesus's proclamation. The greatest commands are to love God and love others, because what he's doing there is he's basically just commanding us or instructing us to be like the Trinity, to love God. The Trinitarian members love each other, they're loving God, and to love others. And that's what the Trinitarian members are doing. They're loving one another. So we're to be like that. We're to be like God as Trinity.
Yeah. Okay. So that brings us pretty much to the end of what we had planned. And as of right now, nobody has typed questions in the chat. So I'll say, if you're watching and you have a question for Adam about the Trinitarian metaethical theory, then go ahead and type it in the chat and I will ask him. But since no questions have come in yet, I want to do my best to put on my skeptic hat here and push back. So one way that I was thinking we could push back is specifically on when we explained moral values. We said that something is good insofar as it resembles and you said loving relationships between the persons of the Trinity. And so this is where I said maybe throwing Euthyphro at the model, which I don't think this would necessarily count against your model. It's just Euthyphro arguments are going to be used against pretty much any theistic account. And so maybe this could be the objection. I think that it's something like, who was the guy from Georgetown that he wrote this article?
Mark Murphy?
No. He was a skeptic. No, I forgot the title of the article off the top of my head. But it's basically, it pushes the Euthyphro one step back. So instead of making it about obligations, like is something right because God commands it, or does God command it because it's right? Instead of doing that, this guy pushes it one step back and says, is something good because it's in God's nature, or is it in God's nature because it's good? Now, for your model, it could be posed this way. Are these relationships loving? So these relationships between the Trinity, loving because they're part of God's nature, or is God's... I'm losing my words, but you get the idea. Is it loving because it's in his nature, or is it in his nature because it's loving?
Yeah. No, I know exactly where you're going. And I think the best way to think through this issue, because the danger is, one of the horns of the Euthyphro dilemma is that it almost seems as though there's got to be some external standard. There's got to be some sort of moral standard that we can even apply towards God and say, and use that to say that these loving relationships between the members of the Trinity are good or are loving. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the horns of the dilemma. The other horn would just be arbitrary. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess whatever God is what's good.
Yeah.
And I guess there's a sense in which, we are saying that I think here's the best way that I can conceptualize it. Before creation, before God created any other beings or anything else or any planets or any universe, right? Before creation at all there was God, right?
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't anything else. There just was God. And if Christianity is true, then, it was God as Trinity, these three persons in loving relationships with each other. And that's all there was. That there was nothing else. And so that's primordial. I kept using that term tonight, but you don't understand what I mean by that. That's like, this is ultimate reality. That's all there was. That's just these things.
Mm-hmm.
And if Christianity is true, then the way that these three persons interacted with each other were to give one another honor, to give one another respect, to care for one another, to value one another, right? To put one another first. All these different things, how they interacted, they gave each other glory or respect.
Mm-hmm.
That's just how they are. That's just how God is. Now we might come to that then and say, okay, this is what reality is. This is what ultimate reality is. Just these three persons, one being, and they love each other, or they treat one another this way. And we might just use the term love to describe the way that they're acting, or describe the way that they're being in relationship with each other. So we're just using that term love, right, as a simple way to describe the things that they're doing or the way they're interacting with each other. It's kind of like maybe we use the word cool or hip, right? Just to very quickly say, when I say, hey man, Jordan's really cool, people know what I mean by that. I don't have to go through and explain, well, he wears cool clothes and he's, really nice and all these things. We just use cool as a way to kind of summarize all those things. And I think in this context, we're using the word love or loving just to summarize all those things that the Trinity is doing. And so there isn't any other standard. There isn't anything besides ultimate reality at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Right before creation, that's just all there is. There's just God as Trinity. And so when he created other beings, the universe, humans, angels, whatever, then anything that was like that or similar to how God is, we would say is morally good. And when it doesn't, it's morally bad. So there is a sense, and this might help with the Euthyphro dilemma, there is a sense in which something is restraining God. And one of the horns of the Euthyphro dilemma is that to avoid God just being able to do anything arbitrary morally, say that rape is good, for instance, there has to be something. The other horn of the dilemma is that there has to be something that constrains God, that prevents him from, let's say, saying that rape is good.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're taking that horn, in a sense, not really, but we're taking that horn and saying, yes, there is something that constrains God. And for some Christians, they get very uncomfortable with that. Nothing restrains God. But actually, what we're saying, the thing that restrains God is not something external to him. We're saying that the thing that restrains God is internal to him. It's his moral nature, his moral Trinitarian nature, as I would say it. That's what restrains God. And he even says this. So like God explains in the Bible that he can't lie, because that would violate his moral nature. And so the constraining isn't some external thing. The constraining is his moral nature itself. And I think that has always been the solution that theists have used, even possibly Plato himself, who verbalized first the Euthyphro dilemma. That's always been the solution that theists have had. And I think the Trinity just helps clarify it.
Yeah. I'll have to think more about that. And maybe we can talk when we finish up, but I don't want to keep the live stream going too much longer. I want to get to Samuel. He's the only one that asked a question. He wrote several, so let me try and just look at these real quick. You can't see the live chat, right?
I don't think so.
I'm afraid I could put it on the screen, but even then you wouldn't see it, so never mind. So the first question says, how would you all address the contingency problem? The fact that God has the same nature and exists in every possible world does not show that God's commands are grounded in reasons, or even that God's nature is grounded in reasons. So either God's commands are grounded in reasons, or even his nature is grounded in reasons. So it seems there is no reason that love is good as opposed to hate, but it is just the way God is. I know that was a lot.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which we're saying that, yeah, that is the way that God is. That's kind of what I was saying before, is that before there was creation, before there was the universe, all there was is just God. That's all that there is.
Mm-hmm.
And God is a certain way. There's three persons, and they treat one another a certain way. And yeah, I guess we can choose to call that love, or we can come up with another word to describe their activity towards one another.
He added this comment that might help clarify. He said, it seems like there should be a reason why love is good and hate is bad. There intuitively seems to be something important about the facts of the matter about love and hate that makes them right and wrong. So that was everything he wrote.
Okay. Well, yeah, I would just say the making that I'm proposing is that what makes, if I would treat Jordan in a loving way, my theory at least is proposing that my treating him in a loving way is good because it resembles ultimate reality, or it resembles God. It resembles the way that the Trinitarian members treat one another in a loving way. So that just is the theory.
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes something good, is when it reflects the Trinitarian relationships.
Yeah, and we want to say that the members of the Trinity could not, at least in some respect of saying this, could not treat one another differently. It's all grounded in, like, there's a pattern of action there in how they treat one another, and that's that's what we're defining love. And they could not do otherwise. They could not get off track from that pattern of action, if that makes any sense.
And this might be where he's getting at with the terms necessary and contingent, because what you're saying is what we would is what I'm trying to communicate, that it's necessary, that this is a necessary aspect of reality. That's who God necessarily is. It kind of goes back to what we talked about with his nature, right? A human nature, a divine nature, a horse nature, or a mouse nature. It's what they essentially are, or necessarily are, mm-hmm. to be that thing. They couldn't be otherwise. So if they were, then they wouldn't be that thing.
If they were to treat one another in a different pattern of actions, I'm trying to avoid the word love as much as possible. If they were to treat one another differently, then they would not have God's nature at that point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's just impossible. It's kind of like, it's impossible for God to lie.
Yeah.
It would be impossible for the Trinitarian members to treat one another in an unloving way.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's fine, if somebody wants to posit another standard, and this is what Weilenberg does. He posits that there's just these brute truths that love is good, or other brute ethical facts. So you can posit other standards. You can posit other ideas that would explain why something is good. But I, as a Christian, I'm putting forth the Trinity as the ultimate moral standard. So if Samuel's a Christian, I would just ask, well, what other standard could there be? And there are Christians that lean more towards Platonism, but it just seems to me that God, before creation, before he created anything else, that's all there was just the Trinitarian relationships. God is Trinity, and
mm-hmm.
So what else could there be for a standard besides mm-hmm. that?
Yeah, and this could lead to a totally different conversation. So maybe if you focus on your defense, obviously, But maybe at some point, if you want to come back on and then compare yours to Weilenberg's, I'd love that.
Yeah.
But it seems like the key thing that's missing in Weilenberg's model is persons. It seems like even if he posited that love is this like brute ethical fact, but there's no person there, then that seems like it's lacking. Like in what way is that thing love? What it I don't know. You probably get what I'm going at. It seems like once you take the persons out of it, the persons of the Trinity out, and you say, but love is still there, I have a little bit of hard time understanding what that means.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's just another intuitive way of saying that, our intuition tells us that for love to have a source, it has to come from a personal source. Mm-hmm. It just can't come from nowhere, or just can't be this truth floating around out there. It's a much more plausible and fitting explanation to say that ultimate reality is these persons in loving relationship with each other. That's ultimate reality. It makes a lot more plausible sense, at least to me, than saying that just these moral truths are what make up ultimate reality.
Well, very good. All right, everyone, I will wrap it up there. Thanks for watching, and maybe we can get Adam back on sometime if he's open to it. And I would encourage you to check out my interviews over the next few weeks. I've got not doctor yet, but soon to be, Eric Sampson, I believe that's right, talking about critiquing error theory. A couple of arguments in particular for moral nihilism. He'll be on Monday, I believe. And then after that, I have an interview about Reformed epistemology. And then this will be fun, I've got a debate review with Liz Jackson. She participated in a debate with a big-time atheist YouTuber, Cosmic Skeptic, on Pascal's Wager. And anyone that watches this channel knows I'm a big fan of certain versions of Pascal's Wager. And I think Liz offers a really robust version. And so we'll be reviewing this debate that she had with Cosmic Skeptic. So please check those out. And please consider liking and subscribing to the channel if you've enjoyed the interview, and it's really important. It helps me out if you turn on the little bell. You'll get notifications of when I go live and when I post new videos, and it helps promote my channel. So I really appreciate you, Adam. If you can hang around for 1 minute and we'll finish up. But to everyone else, good night.